You are now part of a social experiment.
See now where my limit is. Only got no
This scholar named Dr. Derek Bell, he came up with this concept, pretty much called interest convergence. He's African American, Black. And, he pretty much said like decades ago, like Black people, we're not going to get anything done in this country unless we can convince that it also helps white people too. Like all of our gains, all of our gains from like being emancipated from slavery or even getting civil rights, like when you understand like the rationale for how those things came to be, it was via interest convergence. It wasn't because white folks kind of like felt it in their heart at that particular time. This concept of interest convergence, like you saw Abraham Lincoln, for instance, like you hear that story all the time. He didn't want to free the slaves because he liked us. He wanted to save the Union. So that's a primary example of interest convergence. And so I think from a communications perspective, there needs to be more arguments around how reparations is not about preferential treatment, right, for one group. It's about making sure, guaranteeing that all groups are treated equally. And the data clearly shows that Black Americans, they're presently not being, treated equally. And all of society benefits when we're all treated equally. But that's more of a weaker argument. On another point, there was a poll that came out from Berkeley's Intergovernmental Studies that you just cited, where they said 59% of those polled, they polled 6,000 California voters, and they kind of extrapolated that to say, that represents, the state of California. They said 59% of those polled were against cash payments. Most of that 59% were Republicans, right? Democrats were in favor of it, I think 43%, but that's still kind of low. But what I wanted to point out, though, in that same polling of that 6,000 people, even though the majority said they were against cash payments, the majority also said that the state of California was doing not enough for Black people. And the majority of those same people polled said that they understand that the legacy of slavery still impacts Black Californians. And so, I saw those two kind of like, okay, glimmers of hope, right? People understand there's a problem here. They might not agree that cash is the solution, but they at least understand that the state's not doing enough for Black folks, and that the legacy of slavery still persists. So we can work with that, right? And that's literally what's happening, right? We have 19 bills out right now. None of them are, directly cash payments related, but, they're all working to address that legacy of slavery that the majority of Californians understand needs to be eradicated.
Right. On your social media, you posted a documentary on ABC looking at the reparations going on in California. I checked it out. It was really good.
Oh, nice.
And one of the things I noticed in the documentary that was mentioned was that, if this does pass, it can cost California, the state, over $800 billion. And I know people are worried about, well, I don't want to pay for that. I want that coming out of my taxes. So where does that 800, I know you guys made recommendations on, where this money comes from. So where does $800 billion comes from? Where does that come from?
Yeah, I was actually talking about this earlier in a sense. So before I get to that, San Francisco had its own reparations task force. And they actually recommended that all Black San Franciscans get $5 million. But they didn't really hire any experts to help them come up with that number. They just kind of arbitrarily came up with the number of 5 million, citing, the cost of living in San Francisco is really high. Like, we're being pushed out, 5 million, that'll be sufficient for us to, stay and thrive here, which is fine. Fair enough. But the California Reparations Task Force, we kind of took a different approach. None of the our task force members were economists. Jovan Scott Lewis actually does have some training in economics, but we understood that part is a little bit above our pay grade, but we knew we had the duty as part of the statute to seriously consider compensation. And so we actually hired 5 economists and public policy experts to help us essentially gather data to help us come up with a claim or an argument for what, if anything, the state of California owes descendants of slaves for systemic discrimination. So, we only had 2 years to do this work. We hired these economists almost a year into our work. Some of those economists included Dr. William Darity. So he was one of our our economists that we hired. Dr. William Spriggs, who's the Dean of Economics at Howard. He actually passed away before our last hearing. He was on our economics team. And so essentially, in the limited time that these economists had, they were able to find data to show that the state of California was culpable in discrimination in 5 areas: health harms, devaluation of Black businesses, unjust property takings, housing segregation, and mass incarceration and over-policing. And so within each of those areas, they made an argument for, how and why compensation should be owed to descendants of slaves for each of those areas, which in total equal to $800 billion, which is, matter of fact, 3 times the annual budget of the state of California. So it is a pretty astronomical number. But, that's the numbers. That even Don Tamaki said that. He said, we can't shy away from that number, right? That's the number that the economists came up with. That's what they stated. The California worked to dispossess Black Americans from. So for instance, Jovan Scott Lewis, just to conclude, he, articulated this very well in justifying this $800 billion sum, right? We were saying, we're not actually recommending the state give money to Black people. We're recommending the state return money to Black people, return monies dispossessed via racially motivated eminent domain or via racially restrictive covenants and redlining, right? And housing segregation, right? All of these, or devaluation of Black businesses, right? All of these instances that have prohibited and prevented Black Californians from accumulating, generational wealth.
So every day I'm going hard. I'm talking business, bank accounts, and credit cards. And somehow we defeat the odds and making sure that no one starves illegal or you had a